Winter, 1943. The North Atlantic was a graveyard. Beneath the endless waves lay the broken spines of merchant ships, their cargoes of grain, fuel, and hope resting on the ocean floor. Every day Britain bled a little more. Without supplies from America, the island would starve. The war would be lost not in battlefields but in silence, at sea. In that silence something moved. Invisible, relentless. The U-boat. They came by night, slipping through the waves like sharks, their periscopes cutting the surface just long enough to strike. One torpedo, one explosion, and an entire convoy could vanish before the dawn. To the sailors aboard those freighters, the enemy was not a man or a nation. It was the deep itself. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest, coldest war of them all. The Royal Navy had destroyers. The Americans sent corvettes and escort carriers. But even together they could not cover the vastness of the ocean. There were always gaps, black zones of radar and radio, where the wolves of the sea hunted freely. Britain needed something faster, something smarter, something that could see farther than steel. And so, from the heart of a war-torn island came a strange idea. A plane built not from armor but from wood. It began as an experiment, an act of defiance against logic. Geoffrey de Havilland, the engineer behind it, believed that speed, not strength, was the key to survival. If you can't outrun them, he said, you'll die. So make sure you can. His design was dismissed by the Air Ministry as fantasy. No metal armor, no defensive guns, no heavy bomb load. A bomber made of plywood in an age of steel. But de Havilland persisted. When war turns desperate, even impossible ideas begin to sound practical. The first prototypes flew in late 1940. They were sleek, light, and fast, faster than any fighter in the sky. Pilots who saw them in flight called them ghosts. The name stuck, the Wooden Wonder. At first, the Mosquito was used for reconnaissance and precision bombing. It darted over Berlin at altitudes too high for German defenses, photographed entire cities, and slipped away before the sirens began. But by 1943 the war's center of gravity had shifted to the Atlantic, and Britain's most urgent battle was not in the air but on the water. Every convoy that left Halifax or New York carried more than supplies. It carried the future of Europe. And every convoy was hunted by U-boats. In early spring, RAF Coastal Command, overlooked, underfunded, desperate, received its first Mosquitoes. They were meant for patrols, but the pilots saw something else in them, a weapon. The first night they took off from St. Eval, Cornwall, the airfield was wrapped in fog. Mechanics tightened bolts by lamplight. Ground crew whispered good lucks. The pilots climbed into the narrow cockpits, the smell of oil and sea salt thick around them. Twin Merlin engines came alive with a scream that rolled across the cliffs. As the planes lifted into the sky, the ground disappeared. Ahead lay only ocean and darkness. They flew low, skimming just above the waves, scanning for shadows. The radar hummed softly, sweeping its green light across the black. Hours passed. Nothing. Then an echo. Small. Distant. But real. The navigator called out the bearing. The pilot banked sharply. Clouds broke, moonlight spilled across the sea, and there it was. A thin gray shape, barely visible, a submarine surfacing to recharge. The Mosquito dived. The engines roared. The U-boat crew saw it too late. They scrambled for their guns, tracers arcing upward, red against the silver light. The Mosquito released its depth charges in a single heartbeat. The sea exploded. When the spray cleared, the submarine was gone. Only oil and foam remained. The pilot circled once, watching the surface ripple. He didn't cheer. He didn't speak. He simply turned for home. That night, when he landed, the ground crew ran to greet him. His co-pilot stepped down first, his face pale and empty. "First one," he said quietly. "But not the last." Word spread through Coastal Command that the Mosquito had drawn first blood. A wooden plane had sunk a steel Predator. What began as an experiment had become a weapon of war. In London, strategists barely noticed. The headlines were about bombers over Germany, not lonely patrols over gray water. But out at sea, sailors began to look up when they heard the hum of twin engines. They called it the Angel Sound. The Mosquito's success came not from its size or strength, but from its daring. It flew where logic said it couldn't, fought in weather that grounded everything else, and struck faster than the enemy could react. For the men who flew it, every mission was a test of nerve. They faced not just the enemy but the sea itself. Storms tore at their wings, salt corroded their instruments, fatigue blurred the line between sky and ocean. Yet they went again and again into the dark. Somewhere between those storms and silences, the Mosquito found its purpose. It was no longer just a machine, it was a symbol. Proof that innovation could rise from scarcity, that courage could take shape even in wood and glue. In those cold months of 1943, as Britain teetered on the edge of famine, the Mosquito became the unseen hand that held the island's heartbeat steady. The Atlantic was still vast, the enemy still deadly, but for the first time, the hunters beneath the waves began to feel hunted themselves. And in that turning of the tide, in that fragile balance between invention and extinction, began one of the most remarkable stories of the war. Because in the quiet hours before dawn, when the sea was calm and the sky was black, a whisper would rise from the horizon, the hum of two engines closing fast, and every submarine commander knew what it meant. Death had learned to fly. The Mosquito was born out of contradiction. In an age obsessed with armor and firepower, it was delicate, almost fragile. Where the Americans built their aircraft from metal and rivets, the British turned to carpenters. Spruce, birch, and balsa wood, the same materials used for pianos and furniture, were now pressed into the service of war. In workshops from London to Hatfield, craftsmen who had once built tables and cabinets now cut wing spars with surgeon's precision. Women worked by lamplight, gluing the wooden skins together by hand. The air smelled of sawdust, not steel. There was beauty in it, strange, fragile beauty, and yet every piece they built was meant to face death. The Mosquito was a contradiction not only in design but in spirit. It was fast but unarmored, powerful but vulnerable, simple yet revolutionary. When the first production models reached the squadrons of Coastal Command, even the mechanics were skeptical. One of them reportedly muttered, "If this thing ever meets a wave, it'll fold like a deck chair." But the pilots saw something else. When they opened the throttles and the twin Merlin engines howled, the aircraft seemed to come alive. It rose from the runway with a lightness that defied physics. The controls were responsive, almost telepathic. "She flies like she knows what you want," one pilot said. "You just think it and she's already there." Coastal Command, long considered the forgotten branch of the Royal Air Force, finally had something that gave them an edge. They were tasked with keeping the Atlantic supply routes open, a job as vital as any bombing raid over Germany. Without them, no army could move, no nation could eat. And yet, the men of Coastal Command fought in anonymity. Their victories were unrecorded, their missions uncelebrated. No one wrote songs about hunting submarines in the rain. Still they flew. Their days began in silence. The fog rolled in from the sea before dawn, wrapping the airfields in gray. The sound of the engines broke that silence like a heartbeat. The ground crews watched as the Mosquitoes took off one by one, their propellers slicing the mist, vanishing into the void. For 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours, the crews flew over water that stretched forever. There was no horizon, only a smear of gray between sea and sky. The radio crackled with static. The compass needles trembled. The ocean was both ally and enemy. It hid them from the submarines, but it also waited patiently to claim them if anything went wrong. Inside the cockpit, the air was damp and cold. Condensation froze on the windows. The navigator's fingers cramped as he marked bearings on a wet map. The pilot's eyes burned from staring into the void. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear but the thrum of the engines. That sound became a kind of comfort, the proof that they were still alive. Sometimes hours passed without a single sighting. Then suddenly a flash, a periscope cutting the surface, a faint ripple in the water. The radar would catch it first, a small pulse of light sweeping across the screen. The crew's bodies reacted before their minds did. The Mosquito dropped altitude, engines screaming, the sea rising to meet them. They flew so low that waves licked the belly of the plane. At that height, one mistake meant instant death. But it was the only way to attack before the U-boat could dive. A German captain once described what it felt like from below. You hear it before you see it, a shriek from the sky. Then there is fire, and the sea itself seems to explode. To the U-boat crews, the Mosquito was a phantom, silent until it was too late. To the British, it became something sacred. Every time a convoy survived another night, they thanked the unseen pilots who patrolled the skies above. But the truth was harsher. For every submarine destroyed, a dozen patrols ended with nothing but exhaustion and silence. The ocean did not give up its secrets easily. And when the weather turned, which it always did, even the bravest men felt small. Captain Michael O'Rourke, an Irish pilot with No. 248 Squadron, described one mission in his log. The clouds closed in. Radar useless. Instruments icing over. We flew by instinct. The sea was black as ink. I thought of home, of firelight, of my mother's voice. Then the navigator shouted, "Contact." I couldn't see a thing. We dove anyway. They never found the U-boat that night. But they made it back, barely. In the mess hall, after missions like that, the men drank quietly. They spoke little about fear, but it lived in every glance. Each time the door opened, someone looked up, half expecting to see a friend who never returned. The war was eating them slowly, one patrol at a time. And yet they continued. Because they believed the ocean had to be held. Because somewhere beneath those waves an enemy still hunted. By late 1943, the Mosquito had transformed from an experiment into a lifeline. Its patrols stretched across the Bay of Biscay, the North Sea, and even to the frozen routes of the Arctic convoys. The Germans called it Der Holzgeist, the wooden ghost. Every night that ghost haunted them. And as each day passed it evolved. Engineers fitted rockets beneath its wings, radar in its nose, fuel tanks that extended its reach deep into enemy waters. It could now strike before a submarine even surfaced. The balance of power was shifting. The Mosquito was no longer just a bomber or a scout, it was a hunter. The first of its kind. And in the long war between air and sea, the hunters were beginning to win. But for the men who flew her, victory came with a price. The strain of constant patrols, the sleepless nights, the endless roar of engines, it wore them down. One navigator wrote home, "I can't remember silence anymore. Even when I close my eyes, I still hear the hum." In that hum, the line between machine and man began to blur. The Mosquito wasn't just something they flew. It was part of them, a fragile, furious extension of their will. And as 1943 drew to a close, they would need that will more than ever. Because the Germans were preparing to strike back. The Bay of Biscay, long considered a graveyard for ships, was about to become a graveyard for planes as well. Night over the Bay of Biscay was unlike any other place on Earth. The sea was black glass, reflecting the stars so perfectly that it was impossible to tell where sky ended and water began. The wind was constant, soft, almost tender, carrying with it the faint smell of salt and death. To fly there was to balance between two infinities, one above and one below. The Mosquito crews called it the edge. Every mission that took them across that sea meant flying into uncertainty. They were chasing shadows in the dark, guided only by radar, instinct, and a kind of stubborn faith. By early 1944, the Germans had adapted. Their U-boats now carried heavier anti-aircraft guns, mounted on the conning tower. Instead of diving, many captains were ordered to stand and fight. They waited for the Mosquito to come, their guns primed, their crews ready. It was a dangerous gamble for both sides. For the pilots, the moment they dived for attack meant exposing themselves to a wall of fire. For the submariners, it meant daring the impossible, fighting the air itself. The sea became a killing ground. On the night of February 11, 1944, Squadron leader Eric March and his navigator took off from Predanach Airfield in Cornwall. Their target, a suspected U-boat refueling area west of Brest. The weather was atrocious, sleet, high winds, visibility near zero. The kind of night where even the stars refused to appear. March wrote later, "We flew by faith, not by sight. The instruments iced up. We could hear the engines, feel the shudder in the frame, but we might as well have been buried in fog." At 2:17 a.m. the radar flickered. A faint echo. Range 6 miles. Altitude, sea level. They banked hard, dropping to 100 feet. And there it was, a black shape, faint against the silver waves, a moving wound on the surface of the sea. The Mosquito roared in. The first burst of gunfire tore through the night. Tracers streaked upward, red and green, burning like fireflies. The cockpit filled with the rattle of impacts. March held steady, lined up the target, released his rockets. The sea erupted. When the smoke cleared, the U-boat was gone. March's Mosquito limped home on one engine, trailing smoke. They landed just before dawn, the fuselage shredded with holes. The ground crew counted 48 bullet strikes. March simply climbed down, lit a cigarette and said, "They shot straight tonight." It was gallows humor, the only kind that survived the sea. Each crew developed its own rituals. Some carried photographs of home taped to the instrument panel. Others rubbed a coin before takeoff. Most simply touched the wooden skin of the aircraft and whispered something only it could hear. For many, the Mosquito became a friend, even a guardian. They spoke to it as if it were alive, as if it could understand their fear. One pilot said, "She was made of wood, but she had a heart, and it beat with ours." But courage and faith could not always defy the ocean. On March 7, 1944, 2 Mosquitoes from No. 235 Squadron were lost in a single mission. They were attacking a U-boat group off Lorya when heavy flak struck one, shearing off a wing. The second went down moments later, caught in the explosion of its own rockets. 4 days, search parties found nothing, only oil slicks and drifting wreckage. In the mess hall that week, the empty chairs grew. The silence lengthened. Still, the missions continued. The pilots learned to fight the fear by focusing on the routine. The pre-flight checks, the pattern of the radar sweep, the rhythm of breathing. The ocean tried to swallow them, but repetition became their defense. And something began to change. The more the Mosquitoes hunted, the less the U-boats surfaced. German convoys started moving only at night, hugging the coastline, running deeper and deeper. The wolf packs that once dominated the Atlantic were dissolving, scattered and afraid. The men of Coastal Command could feel it, the shift in the tide. They were winning. But victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. Like holding your breath for too long. Each mission took a piece of them. The noise, the darkness, the constant strain, it wore down nerves faster than bullets ever could. Many returned from patrols unable to sleep. Some never spoke of what they'd seen again. There was one story, told quietly, passed between squadrons. A Mosquito on night patrol, lost in fog, had spotted a flare at sea. They assumed it was a distress signal and went lower. But it wasn't. It was a trap. The U-boat fired. One shell struck the cockpit, killing the pilot instantly. The navigator, half blind and bleeding, took the controls. He flew for 2 hours by instinct, guiding the wounded aircraft home. When they found him, he was still gripping the stick, his hands locked in rigor. The Mosquito had landed itself, sliding to a stop on the runway as if guided by ghosts. Stories like that spread through the ranks. They called it luck, but it felt like something else, as if the aircraft itself refused to die. By April, the Mosquito had become both a legend and a warning. To the Germans, it was a curse whispered over the radio, Achtung Holzgeist. To the British, it was salvation. In the cold corridors of command, statisticians began to notice something extraordinary. The sinkings of Allied ships had dropped by half. The U-boat fleet, once Germany's greatest weapon, was crumbling. But the pilots didn't read statistics. They read the sky. And they knew the sea wasn't finished with them yet. On one of the last patrols before summer, Flight Lieutenant John Meredith described the moment that defined his war. "We were over the bay at dawn. The light was thin, the water silver. Then I saw it, a shape breaking the surface. I dived. We hit her square. The explosion lifted us, rolled us, threw us into the sun. When we came level again, she was gone. I remember thinking, this is what hell must look like, beautiful and endless." That morning when he landed, the ground crew counted the hits on his fuselage. There were 20. He smiled faintly and said, "Guess she's tougher than we thought." The Mosquito was tougher than anyone thought. It was not supposed to survive the sea, but it did. It was not supposed to fight submarines, but it did. And the men who flew it, the quiet hunters of Coastal Command, were not supposed to be heroes. But they were. They hunted in darkness, with no glory, no headlines, and no certainty of return. But each night they rose again, wooden wings cutting the wind, chasing shadows that vanished before dawn. Somewhere far below them, deep in the Atlantic, a new kind of silence began to grow, the silence of fear. The hunters had become the hunted. Spring 1944. The Bay of Biscay, a name that once meant safety for German submarines, had turned into a death trap. What had been their highway to the Atlantic was now an ambush waiting to happen. Above the waves, the Mosquitoes ruled the sky. Beneath them, the U-boats crept, praying for clouds and night. For 2 years, the sea had belonged to the hunters of the deep. Now it belonged to the hunters of the air. The transformation had been brutal and fast. Coastal Command squadrons, armed with new rockets and radar systems, flew almost without rest. The aircraft's range had doubled, its weapons refined to pierce a submarine's hull in one strike. To the men who flew these missions, the bay was more than coordinates on a map. It was a living thing. It breathed, it deceived, and it killed. The ocean had moods: the calm before dawn, the sudden squall at midday, the silver twilight that blurred friend and foe alike. And somewhere in that shifting mirror of light and darkness, the war found its cruelest balance. April 29, 1944. Two Mosquitoes from No. 248 Squadron were patrolling west of La Rochelle when they spotted 3 U-boats moving together, a wolf pack surfacing to recharge. The pilots, Thomas Avery and Michael O'Rourke, were already legends in Coastal Command. They didn't hesitate. Avery went in first. He descended through cloud, his engines roaring. The U-boats opened fire instantly, 4 20mm guns and 2 37mm cannons filling the sky with flame. The Mosquito shook under the hits. O'Rourke dove next, using the chaos to close the distance. "Hold steady," his navigator shouted. The rockets fired, a streak of white against the gray. 2 hit home. 1 U-boat vanished in an eruption of smoke and steam. The second began to burn, rolling helplessly on the surface. Avery's plane was hit. Fuel leaking, 1 engine dying, he still circled back, covering O'Rourke's retreat. They made it home barely. The third submarine escaped, trailing oil. For that mission, both men received the Distinguished Flying Cross. But in their logbooks they wrote nothing of medals. Only this: "We were lucky. Others won't be." They were right. In May the Germans retaliated. New tactics, new weapons, and an unspoken desperation. U-boats traveled in clusters, forming flak traps for aircraft. 1 Mosquito could destroy a submarine, but 1 mistake could bring it down in flames. The next weeks were chaos. The Bay of Biscay became a burning graveyard. Smoke rose from the water, mingling with the fog. Pilots flew through storms of fire, their wooden aircraft splintering but refusing to break. Flight Lieutenant David Collier was among them. His last recorded words over the radio were calm: "They're all shooting at once." Beautiful sight. Seconds later, his plane disappeared from radar. No wreckage was ever found. For every victory there was loss. For every U-boat sunk, another Mosquito failed to return. But something irreversible was happening. The balance of terror was shifting. Before 1944, Allied shipping losses had been counted in hundreds of thousands of tons each month. By summer those numbers fell to almost nothing. The U-boat fleet, once the pride of Germany, was dying faster than it could be replaced. The Mosquito was part of that death. Its speed, its reach, its precision, all born from an idea that had once been mocked. The sea no longer belonged to the hunters below. At St. Eval the airfield buzzed day and night. Mechanics patched holes with plywood and prayer. Crews were briefed, debriefed, and sent out again before the adrenaline even faded. Coffee replaced sleep. Laughter became armor. The men joked about the wooden coffin they flew, but they trusted it more than anything else. In those months, the Mosquito became not just a plane but a brotherhood. Pilots swapped notes, shared tricks, and whispered to the wooden frames before takeoff. They believed, half seriously, that the aircraft could hear them, that it remembered, that it cared. One night in June, during a rare calm, Avery stood beside his Mosquito and touched the scarred wing. "We'll go again tomorrow," he said softly. "One more and maybe the sea will sleep." The next day he didn't return. His plane vanished over the bay, no radio, no debris, just gone. O'Rourke flew the search mission himself. 4 hours he circled the coordinates where Avery's last signal had been received. The water was calm, glassy, perfect, indifferent. "There was nothing," he wrote later. "No flame, no oil, no sound. Just the sea pretending nothing had happened." That was the Bay of Biscay, silent, merciless, eternal. By late summer the war in the Atlantic was effectively over. The convoys crossed freely now, their escorts waving at the shadows below. The U-boats fled to Norway, hunted even in their own harbors. But the victory felt hollow. The men of Coastal Command had given everything to win it. Their nerves were frayed, their bodies spent. The sea had taken more from them than the enemy ever could. The war had made them ghosts even while they still breathed. When word of D-Day reached the bases, there was no celebration. Just quiet nods, a few tired smiles. The men knew the war was shifting elsewhere, to the beaches, to the skies over France. But they also knew that none of it would have been possible without the work they'd done, unseen, over an ocean that had tried to kill them every night. And so the Mosquito, that fragile machine of wood and willpower, became something more than a weapon. It became a testament. Each rivet, each scar, each handprint in its grain carried the story of those who refused to yield. The war would move on. The headlines would change. But out there, where the water met the wind, the ghosts of the Bay of Biscay would always fly, invisible, eternal, undefeated. And for every submarine that vanished beneath those waves, there would always be that last image in the minds of those who saw it. A shape diving through the clouds, engines screaming, a streak of white fire in the night. The Mosquito. Hunter of hunters. Born of wood. Forged in fear. Feared by the sea itself. Winter crept back across the Atlantic like a shadow that refused to die. The war was almost over, everyone said so, but for the men of Coastal Command, there was no such thing as almost. Until the last U-boat was gone, every patrol still carried the same weight, the same danger, the same silence. By late 1944, the German submarine fleet was collapsing. Their bases in France were abandoned. Their captains fled north to Norway. But even cornered, they were lethal. Each one was a ghost ship now, part machine, part vengeance, prowling the sea for one last kill before the end. The Mosquito squadrons flew without pause. New aircraft arrived weekly, painted in dull grays, their fuselages streaked with salt and wind. The men who flew them looked older than their years. Their eyes were hollow, their voices low. Sleep came in fragments, food tasted of engine oil and fatigue. At night, the Atlantic shimmered with cold moonlight. The sea looked peaceful from above, smooth, almost beautiful, but the pilots had learned to distrust beauty. When it looks calm, one said, that's when it's thinking. They flew in pairs now. One to distract, one to strike. The tactics had become second nature. Radar contact, dive, fire, climb, vanish. It was rhythm, almost music. The Mosquito's engines sang the same song every night, part thunder, part prayer. But even in victory, the ocean demanded a price. In November, during a patrol off the Norwegian coast, 2 Mosquitoes from No. 143 Squadron encountered a surfaced U-boat firing wildly. The first aircraft struck true, splitting the submarine in half. The second was hit by a shell that tore through the cockpit. The pilot tried to hold her level, but the wooden frame burned too fast. The plane spiraled down, its silhouette glowing red against the ice-gray sea. They never found the bodies. The next morning, the surviving crew flew again. They had to. In war, grief was a luxury. The sea didn't stop for mourning. By the beginning of 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic was more symbol than strategy. The Allies had complete control of the seas, but the Mosquito still flew, part necessity, part habit, part refusal to let go. There was one more enemy to face, the weather. That January was one of the coldest on record. Ice crusted on the wings, froze inside the engines, and built along the propeller tips like glass. The pilots wore 3 layers of gloves, yet their fingers still went numb. The wooden fuselage creaked under the strain, the sound like bones shifting in the cold. Flight Lieutenant James Wainwright described one mission in his logbook. Visibility nil. Altimeter useless. Instruments frozen. Navigator says we're upside down. We're not. Or maybe we are. Sea and sky have no meaning here. Only the hum. I hold the stick and trust the hum. That hum, the steady vibration of the twin Merlins, was the heartbeat of survival. As long as they could hear it, they knew they were still alive. The U-boats they hunted were dying in silence. Many scuttled themselves rather than be caught. Crews surrendered by firing flares, waving white rags from the conning towers. Others vanished without a trace, swallowed by the same ocean they once ruled. By March, there was almost nothing left to hunt. At the bases in Cornwall and Scotland, men began to count down the days, not missions. Some had flown more than 100 sorties. They didn't believe in luck anymore, only endurance. For those who survived this long, the end came not with relief but disbelief. On May 8, 1945, the radios finally carried the words they had dreamed of and dreaded at once. Germany has surrendered. The Atlantic, after 6 years of war, was suddenly still. At Predanak, Banff, St. Eval, the Mosquitoes returned from their final flights. One by one their engines wound down. The silence that followed was deafening. Pilots stepped out onto the tarmac and looked at the sea, unsure what to do. Some smiled. Some cried. Most simply stood, listening to the absence of sound. No more takeoffs. No more echoes over the water. No more ghosts to chase. That night, the mess hall was half empty. Someone played a gramophone, an old song, something from before the war. The laughter was thin, the toast short. The men raised their glasses not to victory but to survival. Wainwright wrote his last entry that night. It's quiet. Too quiet. I keep thinking I hear her engines outside. I don't think I'll ever stop. When the orders came to stand down, they obeyed. The Mosquitoes were parked in long rows, their wings folded, their paint chipped from salt and wind. Mechanics drained the fuel, covered the cockpits, and walked away. The war had ended, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like loss, of purpose, of noise, of comrades who had vanished into the fog. The Atlantic slept, indifferent as ever. In the months that followed, the Mosquitoes were scattered. Some were sent to training bases, others to scrapyards. A few were sold to foreign air forces. The rest were left to decay, their wooden frames warping in the rain. The men who had flown them tried to return to normal life. Some succeeded. Others couldn't. For years afterward, in the quiet of night, they swore they could still hear the engines, faint, distant, just beyond the horizon of sleep. They dreamed of the sea, of radar screens glowing green, of the sudden spark of contact, the dive, the roar, the silence after impact. They dreamed of faces lost to the waves. They dreamed of wood and sky and the hum that meant home. And in those dreams the war never really ended. It lingered in the mind, like the sound of wings that refused to fade. Because how could it fade when those men had given everything to hold back the sea? The Mosquito had been built to hunt, but it ended up saving more lives than anyone could count. It had guarded the convoys that fed nations, that fueled liberation, that turned the tide of the entire war. And yet, it was never made for glory. It was made for necessity, for belief, for survival. In that, it reflected the men who flew it. They were not conquerors. They were caretakers, keeping the world alive one patrol at a time. And when the war ended, they did what they had always done. They turned toward the horizon, whispered a quiet goodbye to the ocean, and walked away. The longest patrol was over. But the sound, the hum of those twin engines over dark water, would never truly die. Peace arrived quietly. No trumpets, no parades, just a kind of stillness that felt unfamiliar. The world had been at war for so long that silence itself seemed suspicious, like a pause before another storm. In the empty hangars of Britain's western airfields, the Mosquitoes sat in neat rows under canvas sheets. Their engines cooled for the last time, their wooden wings gathering dust. Ground crews who had once patched bullet holes now swept floors, unsure what to do with their hands. The sea too fell silent. No more convoys, no more wolf packs. The Atlantic, which had once echoed with the hum of engines and the crash of torpedoes, now stretched unbroken to the horizon. For a time the world tried to forget. The war had left too many ghosts. Nations turned to rebuilding, to families, to homes, to a future made of concrete and peace. But some things refused to fade. In small towns across Britain, former pilots kept fragments of their aircraft. A compass, a patch of fuselage, a propeller blade mounted on a wall. To them these weren't trophies. They were reminders of who they had been, and what they had survived. At night, when the wind blew in from the sea, it brought back the old sounds. A hum, a whistle, a faint vibration that felt almost alive. Some men would pause mid-sentence, listening. "Hear that?" they'd whisper. "Sounds like her." To those who had flown the Mosquito, the memory was never just mechanical. It was human, something between grief and gratitude. They had built their courage out of fear, and the aircraft had carried it for them. One veteran, interviewed in 1958, put it simply, "We didn't conquer the sea. We just kept it from conquering us." The Mosquito had done more than win battles. It had changed the idea of what was possible. Born of wood and glue, it had proven that ingenuity could outpace industry, that belief could outperform armor. It had been designed in a time of scarcity, yet it became a masterpiece of innovation, a paradox that defined the war itself. As technology advanced, jets replaced propellers. The Mosquito was retired, dismantled, forgotten by the machinery it helped protect. But for those who remembered, it remained more than an artifact. It was a story, of men and wood and wind, of silence broken by courage. In the decades that followed, aviation enthusiasts began restoring the few that remained. In old barns and forgotten hangars, they rebuilt them plank by plank, sanding away years of dust. When one finally took flight again in the 1980s, the crowd fell silent. The twin Merlins started with a cough, then a roar that shook the air. An old man in the crowd, a former navigator, wiped his eyes. "That sound," he said, "is what hope sounds like." The Mosquito had returned to the sky, not as a weapon but as a memory made visible. In museums across the world, it sits now in silence, its wings stretched beneath soft lights. Children press their faces to the glass, asking why it was made of wood. The guides explain, about shortages, about speed, about genius, but the real answer lies deeper. It was made of wood because wood was all they had. It flew because belief was all they needed. The men who flew it never saw themselves as heroes. They were simply doing a job, protecting convoys, defending an island, fighting a war they didn't start. Yet, in their quiet way, they became the embodiment of something greater: resilience. Because the Mosquito was not built to destroy. It was built to survive. And survival, in those years, was the greatest act of defiance. When the last veterans passed, their stories lived on in diaries, in fragments of film, in voices captured on static-laced recordings. Listening to them now, one can still hear the rhythm of the sea in their words. The pauses. The wind. The weight of memory that time could not erase. One of them, near the end of his life, was asked if he ever dreamed of flying again. He smiled faintly and said, "I never stopped. Every night I'd take her up. The sky's always dark. The sea's always below. But she's always there waiting." Perhaps that's the truest legacy of the Mosquito, that it exists not in history books, but in the imagination of anyone who's ever faced something impossible and refused to back down. It's in the hum of an old recording, in the shimmer of light over gray water, in the heartbeat that quickens when courage is remembered. The world will build faster, stronger machines. But none will ever carry the same spirit, the quiet defiance of the wooden wonder, the ghost that turned the tide of an endless sea. And if you listen, really listen, you might still hear it, far off, faint but clear, the sound of twin engines over the Atlantic chasing shadows across a world reborn. That sound is not war anymore. It's remembrance. It's the sound of invention, of resilience, of what humanity can create when it refuses to surrender to fear. The Mosquito lives on, in air, in memory, in every act of courage that begins with doubt. Because history does not end when the fighting stops. It endures, whispered through time by those who dare to believe that even the impossible can fly. So, if this story moved you, if you could hear the sea in these words or feel the hum beneath them, then subscribe, not just to this channel but to memory itself. Keep it alive. Keep it flying. Because somewhere out there above the endless Atlantic, where wind meets water and silence meets song, the Mosquito still hunts, not for enemies but for remembrance. And in that eternal flight the world remembers too.